Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on History Valley Podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. James David Audlin. And today we'll be discussing the Galilean Aramaic Gospel of John. We're going to talk about the text, what it is, and its relationship to our Gospel of John, and its differences. We're going to go over some of the differences that it has with the canonical Gospel of John. And so with that being said, James, thank you for joining me today.
Always a pleasure, Jacob.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, same here. Before I get to the questions and some of the other stuff we want to talk about, of course, let's recap. What is the Galilean Aramaic Gospel of John for anyone that's never heard of this thing?
Sure. That's the $64,000 question for those old enough to remember the program. All of you who are familiar with the Bible in English, or perhaps we have some people whose another language is their first language, all of those translations that you're likely to have in your hand are translated from what's called the Greek Textus Receptus, which is a Latin way of saying the standardized text that really wasn't finalized until the late Middle Ages or even early Renaissance. It's based on the Greek, as I said, but we have to recognize the fact that one way or the other, the Greek text is a translation. Why do I say that? Because at minimum, Jesus and his disciples and his early followers spoke Aramaic. And so Aramaic, what they said in Aramaic, what we have in the Greek text, which is translated into your familiar Bibles that you have at your bedside table or whatever, that is from a translation, the Greek. So what I'm striving to do, and what I've been striving to do for 50 years now, is to reconstruct as well as I can the hypothetical original version of the Gospel of John. I'm saying hypothetical because we do not have any manuscript of the original authorship of the Gospel of John. We can only reconstruct it as best we can. So what I've done is to take the manuscripts that are available and from those extrapolate as well as I can the Ur text, the original text. So what I'm about to explain throughout this hour is going to be published in the third and final edition of my book. It's going to take more than 6,000 pages. It's going to be divided into 12 pretty large volumes. So I'm sure folks can understand that I'm trying to boil all that down to 1 hour, which is crazy, but I'm going to try to do it. I'm going to have to leave an awful lot out and focus as best I can on a few main points that will illustrate reasonably well for you what the book is about. So I mentioned that Greek Textus Receptus. By my research, this part is what I've gathered from the fragments that survive from a book written by Papias of Hierapolis. That book is lost as a complete text, but we do have various fragments of it. We also have quotations from it in early sources. So Victor of Capua, for example, is one who tells us that Papias, Papias, if you're taking notes, Papias based his original translation of the Gospel of John, done in the last decade of the first century. He based it on drafts written by John the Presbyter in Aramaic while John the Presbyter was living in Ephesus. But John the Presbyter had never worked those into a complete unified narrative, just simply a draft of this scene, a draft of that scene, like you might say, like a collection of stories. Not fiction, of course, but stories about Jesus and his ministry. So Papias translated it into Greek and turned it into a complete unified narrative. So you can read it from beginning to end without a break in the narrative. And what's wonderful is that both of the manuscripts, the drafts in Aramaic and also the Greek translation by Papias, on which all Greek translations since were directly or indirectly based, were available, were visible in the St. John Basilica in Ephesus for several centuries. And so far as we know, they were last seen by Peter of Alexandria in, I think, I'm going on memory now, but I think it was the early 7th century. After that, they disappeared because Ephesus was invaded and conquered. So where they are today, if they still exist, we don't know. But Peter, like others, described what he found in them. So he's amongst those who give us some hints about that early Aramaic draft collection that John the Presbyter had devised. Now, that means that what extant Aramaic published manuscripts we have of the gospel, the ones that I mainly work with, are not necessarily directly copied from John the Presbyter's Aramaic manuscripts, but rather most of them are back translations. As I said, Aramaic was put into Greek by Papias, and now some scribes whose names we don't know would take those Greek manuscripts and put them back into Aramaic. But there are a few that are early enough that they can give us a sense of the drafts. One of them is the best known one is the Sinaiticus Rescriptus. That's not to be confused with the Greek Codex Sinaiticus, the famous great codex in Greek. This is a different beast. It's in Aramaic, the Sinaiticus Rescriptus, and a few others that are still available for scholars to look at in the Mount Sinai Monastery Library, which is, by the way, the oldest library still functioning in the world. Other important early sources that I consult pretty much daily are what we have of the Diatessaron and also patristic scholars, none of them more important than Ephraim the Syrian, Ephraim of Nisibis, and an earlier colleague of his called Ishudad of Merv. Merv, M-E-R-V, just in case you're wondering, today is found in the country of Turkmenistan, which gives you an idea of how far Eastern Christianity had spread by this time. Now, all of these texts that I'm talking about are in Galilean Aramaic, not Syriac. Today, there's growing interest in universities for students in studying Aramaic, but it's invariably the Syriac Aramaic dialect, which did not begin to supplant the older Galilean dialect until about 4 centuries after the Gospels had been written. Before that time, the Gospels were written in a dialect that Jesus and his disciples spoke, as I mentioned, which is different in a number of ways. It is different in grammar. It is different in syntax. In other words, the word order, like if the verb precedes or follows the noun. It's different in the meaning of words. But the most important difference, and this is one I'm going to return to a number of times, is that like ancient classical Hebrew, it was written with just consonants. The vowels were not written. So like my name, James, if it were ancient Galilean Aramaic, would be JMS, and the A and the E would be understood. So that is a matter that we have to deal with in these Galilean Aramaic texts that I'm talking about. Now, as Syriac came into play, it obviously the gospel texts were now generally copied in Syriac. The first major ones that are important are called collectively the Old Syriac manuscripts. They include the Syriac Sinaiticus and the Curetonian Gospels. A little later, after that, the Peshitta was invented. The Peshitta is a standard translation still used in Syriac churches today. For example, in Syria, Orthodox churches, they still use the Peshitta in Syriac. Generally, the Peshitta, and to a lesser degree, those two old Syriac Gospels, are in coherence with the Greek text. In other words, in terms of meaning, they mean the same thing. Different languages, but means the same thing. So they can be of help to me in doing what I can to hypothesize the original text, especially for contrast. Why is that? Because around the same time that Syriac was catching hold, the organized Christian religion, especially in the West at first, was developing a series of dogmas that were required. Believers had to accept the dogmas. And these dogmas then had a certain influence on how texts were developed. So, for example, the introduction of the Trinity, mainly by Tertullian, and also the change in Aramaic, the fiat that from now on, the Holy Spirit, which in Aramaic, both Syriac as well as Galilean, and Aramaic is feminine, it would be from now on in Christian texts masculine, such that the Trinity was a male-only club of 3 members. Also around this time, the canon was developed. And so these changes in the West especially required that in Syriac there be a conformity to what was expected. Now, it is important to recognize these differences between Galilean and Syriac Aramaic. Because of that lack of vowels, markings for the vowels, which were, by the way, later invented in the Middle Ages. Those of you who read Hebrew will be familiar with the Masoretic text of the Tanakh, which Christians call the Old Testament. And you'll know that there's a system called the Masoretic pointing, which provides, with little marks above and below the text itself, the little marks that indicate the vowels. So for somebody who is relatively new to Hebrew, they can read the consonantal text and then the markings of the vowels above and below and read aloud what is written. A similar system was developed in Aramaic as well in the Middle Ages, but this is before that. Even early Syriac texts do not have these markings for vowels. So if any of you have studied Aramaic enough to encounter a text in the original script, probably the version you have has pointing added to determine what the vowels are to help you with meanings. But those are added by modern editors. For the large part, they are not found in early manuscripts, and especially not in Galilean Aramaic. So with these thoughts in mind, the question arises, how then do we translate? Because one single word can mean several different things. One of them that I analyze in the book has 6 different meanings. Some of them are adjectives, some of them are verbs, some of them are nouns, all with the same consonantal spelling. Now, if you put in the vowel pointing for one or another of those possible meanings, you have a sense frozen into the word, one sense and one sense only. But that's not necessarily the sense that the original writer may have had in mind if there were no vowel markings in his text. And what is more, the original author may have even intentionally wanted to embrace more than one meaning. Let me give you an example in English. William Blake, who's probably my favorite poet in the English language. William Blake, in one of his famous poems, The Little Black Boy, has a line in which the mother says to her child, put on earth for a little space in order to bear the beams of love. Just the word beams. Now, obviously, you could think about the word beams in terms of weight, to bear the beams of love, that love is hard, that love is difficult, that we have to, as Paul puts it in the New Testament, bear the burdens of others. But it also can mean beams of light, sunlight. So as you read the poem, which has a lot of sunlight and shadow imagery in it, you can see that Blake is intending both meanings, to bear the beams of love that are like light in our lives, but also the beams of love that are the responsibility. Well, the same kind of thing, what I'm saying is, the same kind of thing also is true in Galilean Aramaic. So if one word can mean, let's say, 5 things, and you have, let's say, a 5-word sentence, that 5-word sentence, hypothetically at least, could have dozens of different translations, any one of which could be the right one. But the later Syriac froze this, as I said, with vowel pointings that eliminate the other translations, the other meanings, and boil it down to one meaning and one meaning only. And that is the situation that I have to deal with all the time. The manuscripts that I deal with do not have vowel markings in them. So there are Syriac scholars who think that because the texts they're familiar with have vowel markings, and therefore they are clear on what the meaning of a certain phrase is, they insist to me that even though there are no vowel markings in Galilean texts, still the meaning of those Galilean texts has to be the same as what we have in the Syriac texts. So that is the situation that I have. I have to deal with the texts without vowels. So my work, focusing just on the Gospel of John, concentrating the Galilean Aramaic manuscripts, because they are the closest today that we can get to the hypothetical original text, quote unquote, of the Gospel of John. So in ways that will surprise, I think, many people today, after 2,000 years of the dogmas being so widely accepted, that it's hard for them to think of a time when the dogmas weren't invented, weren't required belief, and that we could have multiple interpretations of who Jesus was, what his message for the world was. And that's what we can gather, I think, from the this hypothetical text of the Gospel of John, because the Gospel of John, as I'm sure many of you realize, is the only one that claims to be based on eyewitness accounts. So let me take a pause, Jacob, see if you're okay there, or continue.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and display the Word document up.
Sure.
We're going to start with the page talking about Jesus of Nazareth, or Jesus the Notes 3.
Yes.
Okay.
Wait, take your time. While you're pulling it up, I'll just explain I'm recovering from a bout of chronic bronchitis. So if I lose my voice, I'll carry on as best as I can.
All right.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, now, Jesus is familiarly called in the four canonical Gospels Jesus of Nazareth. And you can see there, I've got the Greek for it, apo Nazaret, which means out of Nazareth. Now, when you go to the Syriac Aramaic texts that I've mentioned, the Peshitta, of course, also those two old Syriac texts, they have once again Jesus from Nazareth, men nitzit. You see that there. Just for those who don't know, Syriac is like Hebrew and Arabic. You read it right to left. So you see two words there. The letters that you see are equivalent to, in English, MN, and then the second word is N, then a letter that we don't have in English, but it's equivalent to the TS sound, followed by an R and a T. So that's Min Nazaret, Nitzret, pardon my pronunciation, and it means from Nazareth. Now, an issue is, while that's familiarly what Jesus is called in your translations, the village of Nazareth probably did not exist in the first century, in Jesus' time. Archaeologist Ken Dark, who published a book in which he describes the remnants of storage structures, hiding places from the late Second Temple period when Jesus was alive, suggesting that it wasn't so much a village as a refuge or repository. Over time, indeed, it was that. There were groups of people who were resisting, fighting against the Roman Empire's seizure of the Holy Land, and they used it as a place of safety, a place also to store food and water and weapons and whatever else. So when finally the village of Nazareth is mentioned 2 centuries after Jesus, it takes its name from one of those groups, the Notzrim. I prefer to call them the Notzrim, but you'll see it translated as Nazarites or Nazareans. And if you wonder who they are, check out Numbers chapter 6. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, the 4th book of the Old Testament, the Torah. In Numbers chapter 6 describes what the Notzrim are about. They took a vow that included several aspects. One of them was that they took no wine and no other materials made from grapes. They had to stay away from dead bodies because they were ritually polluting. And for purposes of our discussion tonight, they also had to let their hair grow. They could not cut their hair. Then they braided or plaited their hair into braids, and then they wound it around their heads into what was called in Aramaic a crown. The word for crown is nazar, and you can hear, I'm sure, that that's related to the word notzrim. So they wore a crown, and what Jesus was called, as I just said, as I didn't just say because I'm going to say it, in the Galilean text, you can see it in the second paragraph there, min nitzret, which means Jesus the Nazarite. Now, if you look at that photograph that I got there, this photograph is taken from the text called the Palestinian lectionary, letter A. There are 3 major Palestinian lectionaries, incredibly important. They were made around the year 1000 in the Common Era, when Aramaic-speaking Christians had to escape from the West because there were inundations of like Vandals, Visigoths, and others. And for the sake of their lives, they had to flee east. They also went east because they were trying to escape from the determination of the early Western Christian religion to force them to change their beliefs to the dogmas that I mentioned earlier were being developed. Now, if you look there at the screen that Jacob's kindly put up, you can see 2 red circles. And if you look at the one on the left, now that's the second column. As I mentioned, Aramaic is read right to left, and likewise your columns run right to left. So if you look at that loop to the left of your screen, and you look at the end of the first line, now the end is going to be the left side, you'll see a word. It looks like an L, Y, and then what looks like an M, and then what looks like an O, and then what looks like an M. But those letters are actually LYSWS, to Jesus. And then the first word on the second line there looks like a kind of a funny looking T. And then you see a vertical line, and then you see like an upside down backwards L, and then you see a little triangle, and then you see something that looks like a K. Those letters are NZRYA. And so what we have there is Jesus Nazariah, Jesus the Notzri. This is not the same spelling as the word for Nazareth. If you look at the my typing up there, you can see that it's different letters completely. NZRYA. And once again, you see down in the lower right, actually an earlier verse in Gospel of John, you can see the same 2 words again. So this is an example that I'm sharing with you of how in the Galilean Aramaic, Jesus was not called Jesus of Nazareth. He was called Jesus the Notzri. My dog apologizes. It's telling us several times that it's apologizing for its voice. So that is an interesting and important variation that we have in these Galilean manuscripts. Now, John 1:45, I should mention briefly, has Demin Nutzrit. If you look at the paragraph that I've typed there in John 1:45, and you look in the second line, you'll see some Aramaic. That second word, the one to the left, That is NZRT. The thing that looks kind of like a wheelchair is a T. And that happens to be the feminine suffix. So that's telling us that it's talking about a woman who has taken the vows of the Nazarites, the Notzrim. And that the context reveals in John 1:45 is Mary Magdalene, of course. She's not a prostitute. She's not a reformed prostitute. That's dogma. There's absolutely nothing to say in the Gospels that says that. And to their credit, the Roman Catholic Church recently corrected that horrible statement that they'd made for centuries, ever since Pope Gregory the Great, that Mary was a prostitute. She wasn't a prostitute. She was actually the daughter of an illustrious family. Her great-grandfather was Gamaliel I, and her great-great-great-grandfather was Hillel. And there are no rabbis in the history of Judaism who are more revered than those two. And it was, in fact, Gamaliel who taught Mary Magdalene how to read Hebrew, how to read Aramaic. He taught her Greek as well, and he taught Jesus, because Gamaliel lived in Galilee. So he was able to help them both to learn. This I've gathered from reading in the Talmud, by the way. So that reference in 145 is interesting because it tells us that Mary Magdalene was also one of those who took the vow of the Nazarites, the Notzrim. So let me pause to see if Jacob's alive there. Should I continue, or do you have anything, Jacob?
You can continue.
Okay. Yeah, just want to check. Okay, another one. This is, I thought it would be interesting, even though it's not an issue in the Gospel of John itself. And that is the question, what was Jesus's job? What did he do? Traditionally, everybody knows that Jesus was a carpenter like his father. The problem is that in Jesus's own time, as still today, there was, and today is, very little evidence of trees whose material can be used as wood for construction or for furniture. Very little of that. Jesus is, in the Greek, such as Mark 6:3, called a tekton, which does not mean carpenter necessarily. The word is a general word meaning day worker. Such a day worker as I have here could be a stone worker, somebody who builds walls, for example, of stone. Could be a ditch digger, could be a fisherman, could be a carpenter. But there wasn't enough work for a carpenter or wood for a carpenter to have a full-time job doing carpentry. So while the dictionaries today generally lead off with the carpenter definition, that's out of deference to the familiar tradition that everybody has heard, that Jesus was a carpenter. So Jesus was not likely a carpenter. The confusion began because of the Aramaic word nigra. Nigra in Syriac, for those who are familiar with the Syriac dialect, nigra does indeed commonly mean carpenter. But here's the interesting point. In the Galilean dialect, and you can check this, you can find Aramaic English dictionaries online and check this for yourself. Everything that I'm saying, you can check. But in the Galilean dialect of Jesus's own time, this word nigra was a euphemism for scholar. And more specifically, it meant a scholar of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That term later would be replaced by a term every one of you knows, rabbi in English, or rabbi in Hebrew, or rebbe in Yiddish. So what these texts, such as Mark 6:3, are telling us, in my view, is that Jesus was known, even when he was young, as a student, as a scholar of the Torah. In other words, he was already being recognized as a rabbi. All right, now we get to one that is extremely important. Did Jesus have female disciples? The tradition, as I don't need to tell anybody, is that Jesus had 12 disciples, that they were all of the male persuasion. But that may not necessarily be so. The 12 disciples, the number 12 is mentioned in the Synoptic Gospels. That's to say Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But John doesn't really refer to the 12 disciples. And it names, as by the way, it names by name only 7 disciples in the Gospel of John. But whether they were all men or not is an interesting question, especially today, because there are any number of excellent scholars, women, who are studying the New Testament, the Gospels, as feminists and finding new perspectives that I think are extremely important to help us correct the tendency over many centuries, 2,000 years, for the organized Christian religion to be male chauvinist. So we have to look at the question of whether or not Jesus had female disciples amidst the male. Now, when you deal with Greek, especially the Greek of the Gospels, the Greek of the New Testament, it's rather unclear. Greek, like any other language, has its aspects where it very clear, concise, and others where it's unclear, just like English or any other. So the word for disciple in the Greek of the New Testament, as you can see it there, is mathetes, and it refers only to male students. So the assumption has always been, because of that word mathetes, that Jesus's disciples were all men. But that is not the case with Syriac, with Galilean Aramaic, where there is a word that we have in the Gospels, at least in the Gospel of John, for a female disciple. And what is present in the text tells us is that there was indeed at least one female disciple. For the purpose of clarity, I've got there the list of all the declensions of the word talmidi, which means disciple in Aramaic. The first 4, where the English is preceded with the word the, those are in what's called the emphatic case. The emphatic aspect. Emphatic nouns in Aramaic is kind of more or less like having the word the before a noun in English. So where we say a disciple, it would be in a different aspect in Aramaic. But when we're speaking about a particular disciple, such that we would say in English the, it uses this emphatic form here. The second 4 in this group of 8 are genitive. Genitive nouns are nouns that indicate the possessive. Now, here's what's really neat. Galilean Aramaic is especially precise in how it conjugates the genitive. It tells us the gender of the person who has these disciples, and it tells us the gender of the disciple or disciples, and it tells us the number, singular or plural. So it tells us quite a bit in one word. Of modern languages, Western languages, off the top of my head, German is probably the most like Aramaic in this matter. So focusing on these, you can see here that the male disciple is Talmida, the female disciple is Talmidia, and the male disciples plural, and here's where a little bit of trouble does lie, male disciples plural is spelled exactly the same as the word for the female disciple, Talmidia. And there is no word that appears in the Gospels for more than one female disciple. Now we turn to the genitive, the possessive. You see his male disciple, singular, Talmida. His female disciple is Talmidwi. His male disciples is spelled the same, Talmidwi. And his female disciples, we don't have that in the Gospel of John. Now, so there's a problem, maybe. The problem is that in both cases, the singular female disciple and the plural male disciples, the conjugation is spelled the same. But don't worry, folks. There is an easy, simple solution. That solution is you look at the verbs, the adjectives associated with the noun, and that tells you if it's a verb conjugated in the singular like we might say is as opposed to are in English. If it's an adjective conjugated in the singular rather than the plural, then we know that the text is talking about one single female disciple. But if these adjectives or verbs are conjugated in the plural, we're talking about male disciples in the plural. So even though it's spelled the same, they you can tell very easily which it is. Hold on a moment. I'm going to shut this window. That may or may not help. So that is the secret here. Now I give a little bit of how often these forms appear. And what you can see there, as an example, the genitive form, the possessive form, his female disciple, appears that in those places in the Galilean Aramaic manuscripts. And you see a list of where his male disciples, same word, spelled just the same, the declension is the same, but it means his female disciple, singular, in the first group of verses I have there, and it means the plural, his male disciples, in the second group of texts. Now, let's look at some examples that I've put here to help make this clear. The first one is in John chapter 2, verse 2. And if you're familiar with the Gospel of John, you know that that's the story of the wedding festival in Cana. Weddings, this will come up a little later, so I might as well deal with it now. Weddings in the first century, Jewish weddings, had several stages. And to some degree, these several stages are still adhered to today. The first stage was that an intermediary went from the potential groom to the potential bride to negotiate a contract, meeting with the potential bride and her family to negotiate a potential contract, which is called in Hebrew ketubah. And that, by the way, is still done today. And the indications, by the way, in the Galilean Aramaic is that John the Immerser, better known as John the Baptist, was the intermediary between the two prospective wedding partners. The second stage was for the couple then to meet and see if they clicked, see if they liked each other, if there was music in the air and little cherubs dancing around when they met each other. And that scene is actually the one in Samaria in chapter 4, but it got disordered, as you can tell. So then after that, there was the consummation. They had sex. And after that, there would be a big party. There would be a banquet, a festival. And that's what we have in chapter 2 in the Galilean Aramaic. So you see there, I've got the verse from chapter 2, verse 2, on the first line there. And it's taken, I have letters there to tell you the source that I took it from. So if anybody wants to look it up, it's from Palestinian Lectionary A, the one that I have in the photograph earlier. And also it's found in the patristic writer Ephraim the Syrian, ES. And what the Aramaic tells us is that Jesus was then called forth to be joined together in marriage, he and his female disciple, in front of the wedding contract and banquet. And as I say, because of the conjugations of the words around there, we know that this is a single individual. This is a very different reading, obviously, from what we have in the Greek, which is that Jesus and his mother were invited to the wedding. It's not that they were invited to the wedding, it was his wedding. And why did that get changed? It got changed later on because, of course, the dogma was that Jesus was never married. Jesus had nothing to do with women. And therefore, they had to rework the text as best they could to have it say something else. But my point to you folks tonight, is that chapter 2, verse 2 in the Galilean Aramaic does suggest that this is Jesus and Mary at their own wedding banquet. Chapter 13, verse 23 is another similar example. This is a scene where there's a meal going on in Bethany, and chapter 13, verse 23 mentions that The female disciple, and you can see up there in the Aramaic, if you look along 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words, you'll see that wheelchair, L, and then a kind of a funny looking shape, and then like a little I, and then a backwards R, and then you'll see another little I, and then you'll see that looks like a K. That's your Talmedia. You can see it on the list up above. And that, once again, is a female disciple in the singular. The verb that follows is in the singular. So it's not that Jesus had all of his male disciples sitting in his bosom, sitting in his lap, but one female disciple. And she is the one whom Jesus loved. That's what the verse here tells us. So this is our first clue that the beloved disciple, whom Greek-oriented scholars argue about who is his identity, is clearly marked in the Galilean Aramaic as Mary. There's just no question who it is, and there's really no mystery whatsoever. So this verse is extremely important as far as I'm concerned, because it identifies for us that Jesus had a female disciple, that it's Mary, and that it's the one whom he loved. The word for loved, you can see there at the very end of the Aramaic. In our letters, the 3 letters there, the one that looks like a backwards R is an R. And then the next one that looks like a U, that's the H sound. It doesn't, we don't have a letter in English like that. And then you see the kind of a boxy looking letter there that's an M. So it's R-H-M, and it's Rachem. And it refers to amorous love, romantic love, the love of husband and wife, have Rachem for each other. And if you're Arabic speaking, you know the word. I immediately think of a very dear friend of mine, Rahma Ben Ali, in Tunisia. Rahma is her name in Arabic, and it's the same word, because Arabic, like Hebrew and Aramaic, they're all sister languages. So that, once again, I'm going to insist that Jesus didn't have romantic husband-wife type love for his male disciples. There's only one way to understand 13:23, and that is that it's talking about Jesus with a single female disciple whom he loved. And then we have chapter 18, verses 1, 2, and 15. I didn't bother with the Aramaic here because they all tell us the same thing, that the female disciple was with Jesus when he was arrested at the garden, and that she was taken along with him and was present through the trials of Jesus before the 2 high priests and before Pontius Pilate, and so on from there. Once again, we see that word Talmedia in these 3 verses that I mentioned here. And once again, they refer to the single female disciple whom we have named. And I'm going to get to her name in a little bit. Then chapter 19, verses 26 and 27. This is, of course, the chapter in which Jesus is crucified. While Jesus is crucified on the cross, these 2 verses appear, and you see my translation. This is a literal translation of the Galilean Aramaic. When Jesus saw his mother and the female disciple, if you look up, you can see Talmedia there, his female disciple who was beloved or condemned. It can also mean that, because there are no vowel markings. When he saw his mother and the female disciples, beloved, condemned, being raised into position, he said to his mother, "Milady, look, your son." Now, once again, this is confirming the female disciple. What's going on with that raised into position? This is another amazing thing that we find in the Galilean Aramaic. There are no 2 thieves. The 2 thieves, which we have in Greek, owe their existence. They're so grateful for this. They're grateful that there was a mistake made in translating Aramaic into Greek, and such that the word became, in Greek, a word that means thief or robber. There is no thief or robber. There is no 2 thieves or robbers in the Galilean Aramaic. Rather, Mary the mother, and Mary the wife, were put into place on either side of Jesus. This was a typical Roman custom. The Romans were geniuses at milking every bit of torture that they could out of crucifixion. And one thing they did was to round up close relatives of the crucifixion victim and tie them to a post with their arms behind them, like so, tie them to a post, forcing them to watch as their dear one died. So here is Mary, Jesus's mother, an older lady, and Mary, Jesus's wife, tied in that manner to posts on either side and forced to be eyewitnesses to their son or husband being killed. It's just horrendous. There, some of the descriptions of crucifixion, such as one that you can find in Pliny the Younger, just bring horror to my heart to read how awful a torture it was. People could be on a cross for days, still struggling to breathe. When you're on a cross, you're nailed to the wrists, by the way. When you're on a cross, the only way you can breathe is to raise yourself up on the nails. And after a while, your arms just give out. And the Romans realized that if they nail the feet, ankles really, to the cross as well, then they could push up on their legs and last longer, even after their arms had given up all strength, and go on for days pushing on their legs and still breathing. Just the horror of this is, for me, inconceivably horrendous. Now, so that's 1926. Jesus saw his mother, the female disciple, beloved, condemned, being raised in position. He said to his mother, "Lady, look your son." And after that, he said to the self-same female disciple, and here there's a fragment of the text, but we can read enough of the word to extrapolate what it was. Magdalene, look your mother. So these are just a few examples. As I listed earlier, there's lots of places in the Gospel of John in the Galilean Aramaic where the word for female disciple appears. These are just a few that I think are especially helpful in understanding how it is used, who she is. And okay, let me check again with Jacob, see if you had anything on your mind.
Not at the moment.
Okay. All right. Okay, then I'll continue on. The next page there, can you, oh no, you never changed the page. I'm sorry.
Oh,
is that the second screen? Yeah, it's the second screen. I'm sorry.
Both pages are here. Like one here and one here. Do you want me to you want me to turn the page now?
Yeah, we want to go to the third page now. How the Two Marys. There we go. Okay, super duper. Okay.
All right.
So you can see the title there, How the Two Marys Are Named and Who is the Beloved Disciple. Now, as I have here, both Jesus' mother and the Magdalene are always called Miriam in the Syriac Aramaic and Mariam in the Greek. And this is universally put into English as Mary. But in the Galilean, they have different terms. Jesus' mother is still always called Miriam in the Galilean of the Gospel of John. And that, of course, is the familiar Hebrew name associated most with Moses' kinswoman, Miriam. But Mary, there's a lot of confusion. This is interesting. In the Galilean Aramaic manuscripts of the Gospel of John, there's a lot of confusion as to the spelling of her name. You see it sometimes, yes, Miriam. And sometimes you see it Maria, as you can see it there in the third line, the second word in, that's M-R-Y-A. And that Maria, especially in John chapter 11, by the way, the raising of Lazarus, that spelling of Maria appears quite often. And the reason that early scribes changed the spelling most often by adding an M to make it the same name as Jesus' mother is because M-R-Y-A is also used as an epithet for God. It's the term that you're familiar with in your English Bible, translated as the Lord. And it refers to Yod He Vov He, the name of God in ancient Hebrew, often transliterated as Jehovah or Yahweh. That's the name Yod He Vov He, or YHWH. Since that name Maria, meaning the Lord, therefore was associated with God, the scribe said, well, obviously Jesus can't have one of his disciples being God. So they had to change the spelling, the number of instances, by adding an M. But Mary's name actually was Maria. Maria is the word that means the Lord. And Maria, with the accent on the second syllable, is Mary in Galilean Aramaic. The trouble is that without vowel markings, they're spelled exactly the same. So the issue was solved by my absolute favorite scribe of all time, a fellow called Elias of Abud. Elias of Abud probably should be credited for inventing the vowel markings that eventually caught on in Aramaic. He put a little dot, a sublinear dot, underneath the Y. If you look at the screen that Jacob's put up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down, about the middle, you will see a word in Aramaic. That's Mary's name. The letters are M-R-Y-A, but if you look closely, under the third letter, starting from the right, of course, you'll see a dot. And that dot was Elias of Abud's invention in order to tell us, put the accent there. This isn't Maria, this isn't the Lord, this isn't God, but rather this is Maria, the woman. Now, here's where it gets fun. This name is originally Egyptian. Moses and Miriam, their names are Egyptian names. Moshe in the Hebrew, Moshe means beloved of Ra, the Egyptian god. And Miriam is a variant on that. So they are named in Egyptian. But Mary's name, Mary Magdalene's name, is simply the word that came from Egyptian that means beloved, not beloved of one god or another, but simply beloved. Her name means beloved. And according to the Talmud, the Talmud is so interesting, and more Christian scholars really need to dig into the Talmud. The Talmud, I should explain, what is the Talmud? The Talmud is a humongous collection of commentaries, basically on the Torah, in which you hear rabbis having conversations and oftentimes debating, how does this mitzvah, how does this law in the Torah apply to our daily lives? And it's a wonderful compendium of information, historical, theological. It's just barrels of fun. I love reading in the Talmud. And the Talmud mentions how the father of Mary Magdalene was originally from Northeast Africa. He was actually from Cyrene, which is now in Libya. But his ancestry goes back to Ethiopia, as it's called today, or the country of Sheba, as it's often called in English, Sabah in the ancient languages. And he was a descendant of the royalty of Sheba or Sabah, including the famous Queen of Sheba, whose name was Makeda. It's not mentioned in First Kings, but her name was Makeda. He was apparently a descendant of her. That's what the Talmud implies to us. And so Mary she came from pretty noble stock. I already mentioned her mother's ancestry with Gamaliel Hillel. Her father was no slouch either. So her name is an Egyptian name, as was Moses' name, as was Miriam's name, but it simply means beloved. So when we talk about the beloved disciple, and scholars discuss who was the beloved disciple, and they all have their various ideas of who it might be, the simple answer is the beloved disciple. That's telling us her name. She was beloved. Mary's name was beloved. I can't help but mention the Toni Morrison novel, Beloved, in which the title character has a lot of interesting similarities to Mary Magdalene. And if I ever meet Toni Morrison, that's going to be my first question. What do you know about that? So I think this is a big clue that helps us solve the mystery that has dogged so many scholars for longest time. Who is the beloved disciple? Who is the eyewitness? In fact, again, early sources suggest to us that Mary Magdalene came in the year 38 or 9. I'm going on memory now. 38 or 9, to live near Ephesus in Anatolia, which is now eastern Turkey, and therefore she knew John the Presbyter, who was in Ephesus itself, and John the Presbyter at a conference that was called in Antioch in the year 42 was charged with writing eyewitness memories, mainly from Mary, to which he also added some of his own, and that was how the Gospel of John came to be. So John the Presbyter wrote in his early drafts something like you have there: Talmedia Recumna de Mara Jesus, which means the female, literally translated, the female disciple, beloved, being her name, wife of the Master Jesus. This is the way a married woman's name was put in those days in Galilean Aramaic. You had her. There weren't first names and last names. It wasn't like James David Audlin. There wasn't like Jacob Ehrman with a first name and a last name. Rather, a married woman, her name would be her personal name, of, and then the husband's name. Even in English translations, you can see that in chapter 19 when it talks about the two Marys, and it has Mary of I'm having a mind block. Mary of with Q. You'll find out when you're my age about mind blocks. So where am I here? 19, 20. Yeah, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. What I'm suggesting is that the Galilean Aramaic of that verse has Mary of Clopas and Mary of Jesus. So it got fiddled with because, of course, they couldn't have anybody come to the wrong conclusion that Jesus had a wife. So that, I think, helps us a great deal to solve the mystery of who the beloved disciple is. So earlier I mentioned to you a translation of chapter 13, verse 23, but now I'm offering to you you want to say something?
No, I say yeah.
Oh, okay. Now I'm offering to you another way that we can translate that Aramaic. Both of them are correct because no vowel markings. You can take it either way. But I'm going to suggest that chapter 13, verse 23 can also be read as saying, so the female disciple was reclined in Jesus's bosom or lap, she being beloved, her name, wife of Jesus. So other verses are traditionally understood referring to the beloved disciple should, in the Galilean Aramaic, I think, be put into English in a similar way. And then the mystery is cleared up. Now, chapter 20, the climax of the whole gospel. And whatever else we can say about the Gospel of John, also, I'll tell you this, not only in the Greek, but even more so in the Galilean, it's incredible literature. It's when you read it in the original Aramaic, it is so incredibly beautiful. It's like poetry. It really is poetry. It's almost like reading an epic poem. It is so alliterative with these same sounds repeating, with leitmotifs reappearing. It's absolute genius, the way the Gospel of John is written. And nowhere is this more the case than in chapter 20. And I'm going to get to, in just a moment here, to an example. Chapter 20 begins with Mary looking everywhere for Jesus's body because it has disappeared. Now, the way you say my Lord or my husband, my master, in Greek, everybody knows as Kyrie. So you can imagine her, if she were Greek speaking, going around Kyrie, Kyrie. Or if she were English, Lord, Lord. But she's not Greek speaking. Well, she did know Greek, but it was a second language for her. What she is actually saying is Murdy, Murdy, which means my Lord or my master or my husband. Murdy was a typical way to to address people. The word appears quite a few times in the Gospel of John in the Galilean Aramaic. For example, the man who is lame, whom Jesus heals, addresses him as Mary. It's a respectful, courteous way to address somebody. So Mary is going around, Mary, Mary. But then in verse 15, she thinks that the figure she sees in the darkness before dawn is a gardener. So she says to him, Mary, just as you expect. But it's not a gardener, it's Jesus. And Jesus then calls her by name. And here is what is interesting. That word Mary that I just introduced to you is homonymous with a form of Mary's name. If Jesus were to say not Maria, which is that name meaning beloved that I just introduced to you, but rather my beloved, my Mary, he would say the same thing, M-R-Y, Mary. So what we had in chapter 20, verse 16, before it got doctored, was Jesus and Mary both saying to each other, Mary. Now, I would be willing to bet that some early scribe, possibly even Papias himself, the first one to put it into Greek, thought, well, this can't be right. They can't say to each other, Mary. There's only one of them is Mary. So we got to fix this. So I think it was around that time that it was changed to Rabboni, which means teacher, as we have it in the Greek. But I read the Galilean of John 20:16, as you see there. He said to her, the Master Jesus, Mary, and she turned, and the word for she turned can also mean gazelle, and I'll get back to that in a moment. The gazelle, the African animal, beautiful animal. I've seen it in Africa. Beautiful animal, kind of like a deer, only much prettier. And she turned, she was a gazelle. She said to him in Aramaic, my teacher. Now, that's the problem, because as you can see there, you have a kind of a wavy line. I have straight lines for all the alliteration of Mary. You have Amr, which means said. That's AMR. That's the first word to the far right. And then you have a little farther along, Amr, Marah, which means master, the master. And then you have Jesus' name. And then you have Miriam, which is Miriam. And then after all that very nice alliteration, she says to him, Marah, which means she said. Then you have Eberasti, which means my teacher. And anybody who's reading the Galilean Aramaic in the original says, that couldn't be what she said, because it's all this Mary, and you expect one more Mary. It's obvious. But it's Eberasti instead, which means my teacher. And so I think we have to reconsider if that is what the hypothetical original text said. Here's where I was years working on this, reading through such scholars, early scholars as Ephraim the Syrian and Ishodad of Merv, whom I mentioned, and others, so that I could do the best I could to reconstruct the hypothetical original version of John 20:16. And here's what I have here. You can see the Aramaic to the left, but look to the right for the English. Then Jesus said to her, my Mary, and she restored to him his bride. It's very different in the Aramaic. And she turned, or you can read that as gazelle, and said to him, my Mary, husband or master. And she hastened to join them each to the other to hold him. Now, this verse, this is part of the interesting ways that you can find confirmation. The Gospel of John, especially in the Aramaic, often makes references to texts in the Tanakh, in the Christian Old Testament, and this is one of them. Song of Songs 2:17. And look at this. You can see how close it is to what we have in John 20. Until the day breathes and the shadows flee, which tells us we're talking about dawn. And this moment when Jesus and Mary come together is dawn. Until the day breathes and the shadows flee, turn around, my beloved, and be to me like a gazelle. So that's the Aramaic word that can mean both turn around and gazelle. Turn around, my beloved, and be to me like a gazelle or a fawn on the mountains of separation. And the mountains of separation is also very apropos, because in this scene, Jesus and Mary, who were separated, come together and become one once again, in what you might say is a kind of a new birth. That what's going on here, I'm going to get to in my final little section. If Jacob, if it's okay to proceed, or anything.
Are you going to go to the next page?
Yeah. Do you have the summary contents? The summary comments?
Yeah, it's right here.
Okay, super. Yeah, I had to reduce the size of your screen so I can see what I've got written here. So I've been studying these Galilean Aramaic texts for more than 50 years. I love to tell the story about how I was in the university library at Syracuse University, and I stumbled upon the pioneering translation of the Gospel of Philip into French by Jacques Menard. And I'm reading along in the French and found how in the Gospel of Philip, which really is not a gospel, but a commentary on the Gospel of John, how the Gospel of Philip speaks of Jesus as having Mary as his koinounos. It's in Coptic, but koinounos is a Greek borrow word. Koinounos means his companion, or you might say his wife. And it further refers to how Jesus kissed her often on and unfortunately the word is lost, but the space is just the right size for the word on her lips. So I'm reading along in the gospel in this library at Syracuse University, and as everybody knows in a library, and I couldn't contain myself. I leapt to my feet, shouted out loud, "They've been lying to us!" And that moment in 1972 is when I began this process that is culminating today with the soon-to-be published hypothetical reconstruction of the Gospel of John. What's going on then is what I'm going to try to relate to sum up. And that is my conclusion. The main message is not as it is in the Greek, that we must believe in Jesus as the Son of God, as the Christ, as God incarnate, as the second member of the Trinity, but rather that the gospel in its hypothetical original form presents Jesus as a messenger from God with the message that it is in unity, one with another, becoming one with others in love, in the image and likeness of Elohim. What I'm getting at is in Genesis 1:26 through 27, Elohim, which is the northern word that was used for God in the times of the Israelites, Elohim, which is a plural. The singular form was originally feminine. Eloha is feminine. It's related to the Arabic word Allah, for those of you who speak Arabic. And Eloha, with the masculine plural, im, feminine noun with a masculine plural. How often does that happen? Basically, this is the only time. But it's telling us that Elohim is both male and female at once. In Genesis 1:26 through 27, Elohim creates the first human being as an androgyne, a male-female is one, in Elohim's own image, which in Hebrew is a masculine noun, and likeness, which is a feminine noun. They are synonyms, but one is masculine, one is feminine. You wouldn't need both if you just want to say in the image of God or in the likeness of God, but the fact that Elohim creates in the image and likeness tells us. And read carefully 1:26 through 27. Elohim says to Elohim himself, "We shall create in our own image and likeness." So the first human being in Genesis 1, and this is confirmed by the rabbis in the Talmud that I mentioned, is an androgyne, male and female as one. And what Jesus and Mary are now doing in this moment in chapter 20 of the Gospel of John at the resurrection is they are becoming one in the image and likeness of God. But it doesn't stop there. The message of the Gospel of John is that we too can become in the image and likeness of God when we unite one with another in love. John the Presbyter says in his first letter, in the first canonical letter, chapter 4, verse 8, He says, God is love. And when we love each other, we are evoking the presence of God, who is love. It's not that God loves us or God loves other things. It's that God is love. The very nature of God is love. And when we come together, be it husband and wife, be it friend and friend, mother and daughter, father and son, neighbor and neighbor, when we unite in love, we are recreating the image and likeness of God. That's what Jesus and Mary are representing for us in chapter 20 at the resurrection. So that's the core of what the Gospel of John is about. Love your neighbor as yourself, not the way you love your neighbor the way you want your neighbor to love you, which is how it's often misunderstood, but love your neighbor as yourself, being yourself is one with your neighbor is one with yourself. Unity, oneness. What we've got going on in the world right now, I'm going to go back like James Charlesworth to my origins as a preacher. What we've got going on right now in Ukraine and Yemen, in Gaza, in other countries, the horrors of war are the very opposite of what the Gospel of John teaches. It is the opposite of love. It is hate. It is destruction. It is evil. Evil, the place we find Satan is within ourselves. There's no guy with horns and pitchfork colored red. We can be satanic. And the Gospel of John, which never mentions Satan in the Galilean Aramaic or anything similar, that came into Christianity from late Zoroastrianism and the mystery religions. It was not original to Christianity. The message of the Gospel of John is to love. And if you forget everything else that I ever said to you this evening, just work with all of us who are striving to bring love into this world such that we can have peace and a world that is not beset with wars and other horrors. Moving on, another matter that we find in the Gospel of John is that it coheres with the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a single year for Jesus' time of ministry before his crucifixion. And once these passages in the Gospel of John are reordered, put back in their normal place, that issue clears up. We have one single year. Quick example that you can check for yourself. Chapter 4 winds up with Jesus spending the weekend with the Samaritans, and because of course you don't travel during the Shabbat, so he stays with them for 3 days, and then it goes on for something else. But you'll wonder what follows upon this. Well, if you go to the beginning of chapter 2, it says, on the third day there was a wedding banquet in Cana of Galilee. So the obvious thing that I realized some 50 years ago was that chapter 4, Jesus in Samaria, has to precede the wedding in Cana of Galilee. It's just as a quick example there. So that issue is another one that's eliminated in the Galilean Aramaic. Another interesting thing is, I say in my third paragraph there, Mary Magdalene is much more on stage in the Galilean Aramaic gospel. Her presence in the canonical gospels in Greek was heavily limited. She was eliminated all over the place. In Luke, for example, there's all sorts of points in Luke and also the second half of that work, Acts, where Mary is obviously present, but it's been kind of written out in the Greek. So in Luke and indeed Matthew and Mark in their ways as well, Mary is much more on stage than we realize from translations. So that is another matter to keep in mind. I already mentioned the wedding in John 2 is that of Jesus and Mary. The miracle of the water turning into wine is a setup. In the Galilean Aramaic, Mary says, go ahead and do it, change the water to wine. And he says, you want me to spring my joke too early? He's actually kind of chuckling with her about what he has planned. The story of the Good Shepherd, this blew me away when I came upon this. The story of the Good Shepherd in the beginning of chapter 10 is not there in the Galilean Aramaic. Rather, the conversation at the end of chapter 9, Jesus goes to the home where the formerly blind young man is being held in secret because some members of the religious hierarchy in the temple are out to get him because they are displeased about this miracle. So he's hiding out with some kindly Pharisees. Jesus comes to where he's being held in secrecy, to make sure he's okay. And the conversation that begins in the end of chapter 9 continues at the beginning of chapter 10, rather than the familiar story of the Good Shepherd, which is extremely interesting. I remember the day that I came upon this in the Galilean Aramaic manuscript, and I'm reading, probably, I was very likely the first person to read this in many, many years, even centuries. I don't know. And I went running to my wife and I said, "You're not going to believe this." Well, I said it in Spanish because my wife doesn't speak English, but I just was so blown away with the amazing fact that I was reading something in the Gospel of John that was completely unfamiliar to me. What a day. Wow. And the year of marriage that Jesus and Mary enjoyed together, as I said, it lasts only a year. The Gospel of John runs from Passover to Passover in the year 29 to Passover in the year 30. And then they resume their marital intimacy during the Last Supper. In fact, when in chapter 13, verse 20 something, I'm not going to look for the verse, chapter 13, 23 or more or less, in the Greek, Jesus, when a woman is pregnant and she gives birth, it's painful. But then when she embraces, takes in her arms her newborn child, she forgets all the pain that she just suffered because of the joy of having brought a new child to the world. In the Galilean Aramaic, the word for the woman, it's the same word for wife, anta. The word is in the genitive, the possessive, and Jesus is saying, when this woman here present with us, he's talking about a woman who's right there at the Last Supper with them. So another issue that a lot of feminist scholars properly mention, were there women present at the Last Supper, is indicated by this verse, yes. And it was Mary, she's pregnant. And he also, at the same meal, talks about the Greek word paraclete, the person who is to take his place after he has died by crucifixion. And again, the Aramaic is very clear that the paraklete in Greek, is a woman, is female. This, of course, created all sorts of problems in the early church because the men those days were male chauvinist pigs, and they did not want to have Mary as in charge over them because they were the men. And a number of early texts, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, the Pista Sophia, have passages where it talks about the antagonism that Simon Peter, Simon the Rock, evidenced toward Mary. But it began in this moment at the Last Supper when Jesus indicated that he expected Mary to be his paraclete. This is clear in the Aramaic. It's not so clear in the Greek because later they had to abide by the dogma. So Mary is with Jesus through all these last chapters, from the arrest through the trial, the crucifixion, tied, as I mentioned, along with her mother-in-law on either side of Jesus. And they're in chapter 20 again. Here's where there was another amazing thing. I found a passage between chapter 19, when Jesus is put in the tomb, and the beginning of chapter 20, early in the morning of the day of resurrection, that is not found in the Greek. And it describes what happened in the tomb during the 3 days that the tomb was sealed. And it's extremely interesting. It mentions the two angels that Mary talks with in chapter 20 as looking over Jesus, protecting him in the tomb. It mentions also how Mary unbinds him. You'll remember that Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea wrap him in cloth. Mary unwinds this, hoping to find life in his body. Number of interesting things that happened during the 3 days and nights that Mary was locked inside the tomb with Jesus. So that's a quick summary of the amazing differences that I find in the Galilean Aramaic Gospel of John that are not so in the familiar Greek text. And at that point, I'll stop, check with Jacob.
We do have a super chat question, a couple of them that I'd like to pull up before we continue. I Fisher, thank you for your super chat. How are the words Anphos, Isaiah 11:1, and there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, a branch shall grow out of his roots, and and Nazarene related?
Huh. Good question. I haven't prepared for that in my mind, but it's a really good question. Let me get I open in front of me. Because there is a connection. I just have to pull it up my head. When you've written a book that's 6,000 pages long, you can't keep it all quite in your head at the same time. This is referring to the coming Messiah, Mashiach in Hebrew. The stump of Jesse. Jesse, of course, is the father of David. And so a sprout from his roots is to say there will be a return of the Davidic monarchy, and the spirit feminine of Jehovah will settle upon him. That right there is directly picked up in the scene of the immersion, or baptism, if you prefer, by John the Immerser in chapter 1, because the Spirit does descend upon Jesus in that scene. So we have a direct connection there. But this, I don't think off the top of my head there's any direct connection to the Nazarene. You have to read about the Nazarene in Numbers 6. A number of prophets, for example, Samuel, Samson, they had taken the Nazarene vows. Paul claims to have taken the Nazarene vows in the book of Acts. John the Presbyter took the Nazarene vows after his wife died. And so there's a number of people who are of the Nazarene mentioned in the Bible, both the Tanakh as well as the New Testament. So that's a few thoughts off the top of my head in answer to that. You said there was another super question?
Yeah, from the same person. I fish in a tie. Thank you for another super chat. Is there any evidence they had a child named Jude?
Not that I'm aware of. The child or children of Jesus and Mary is indeed a very important question. It's one that I've researched a great deal in the early texts, looking for anything that we can find to help us with that. My understanding is that the child that Mary was pregnant with at the Last Supper was born later that year, in other words, after Jesus was dead, around October in the year 30. And this would be John Mark. If you go to Acts 12:12, you have a reference to John Mark as having Mary as his mother. And so my understanding is that is John Mark. I do think, but I haven't yet found enough to support this, so I haven't mentioned it in the book. But I still am keeping my mind open to the fact that Mary was pregnant with twins and that there might have been another. But from the early texts that I read, especially in Aramaic, that second child probably was female, which kind of would make sense with the whole idea of joining male and female, husband and wife, together in the image and likeness of God. But I'm sorry, questioner, I don't remember anything about a child named Jude. Jude, of course, or Judah in Aramaic and Hebrew, was a brother of Jesus. He is traditionally said to have written the very small book of Jude that precedes the book of Revelation. And he was certainly a leader in the early apostolic Christian movement. But I'm not aware of anything early that suggests there was a child named Jude.
All right. I got the document back on the screen.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Now, with your permission, Jacob, may I go ahead with the other item that I wanted to cover?
Sure.
Okay. Some 15 months ago, in a History Valley interview with our host here, Jacob Ehrman, Professor Elizabeth Schrader Pulser was asked by a viewer at the end of the program what she thinks of my work, and she responded with two criticisms. Now, normally, it is not my custom to respond to such things. I've had a number of scholars, generally in the Greek community, the Greek scholar community, attack me ad hominem attacks. I'm used to it. I take it. I'm a peaceful person, so I don't really care to respond particularly. I just ignore it. But in this case, I think it's wise to make an exception because, first, of the nature of what Professor Schrader-Pulser said, and second, because it's been out there for more than a year, unbeknownst to me. I only found out about this because someone was kind to tell me what she said a couple of weeks ago. And the fact that her criticisms, unfounded criticism, had been out there all this time, could have the effect of persuading people to pay no attention to the very hard work that I've done in this field for more than 50 years. And that would be unfortunate, because I think my work is worth a serious look. What I've done with you folks tonight is a brief summary, and some of you are probably thinking the guy's crazy, but in 6,000 pages, I have so much fact, so much backing up what I say, that I think it's pretty solid what I've come up with. Now, to begin, I want to make a few matters very clear. First of all, Elizabeth Schrader-Pulser does not know me. We have never met. We had a brief email exchange. I will get to that in a moment, but she does not know me. And I doubt that she knows anything at all about the contents of my resume. Second, I should emphasize that she is a scholar of the Greek gospel texts. She is not familiar with the Aramaic language. And next, I want to emphasize that she has not read the third and final edition of my book that will soon be published. The third and final edition, soon to be published, is the first edition in which I discuss in depth the Galilean Aramaic texts of the gospel. How do I know she hasn't read it? Because there's one and only one way that anybody is going to acquire a copy of it before it's published, and that's by asking me for it. She never got it from me, so she hasn't read it. Now, Elizabeth Schrader-Pulser's first criticism of me was that I'm not sufficiently acquainted with Aramaic to know what I'm talking about. And she claimed to document this in her email letters to me by saying that she consulted with a Syriac Aramaic expert to ask him if there was any fact to what I was saying about the Galilean Aramaic texts. Now, I have been familiar with all dialects of Aramaic for many years, including Syriac, including Galilean, including Jewish Palestinian, including Christian Palestinian, all of these, Samaritan too. I'm familiar with all these dialects of Aramaic. I'm an Aramaic specialist. The only person I know who has any expertise in the Galilean Aramaic dialect other than me is a young fellow named Steve Caruso. Self-taught, I might add. He's an amateur, but he knows his stuff, and I have a lot of respect for Steve Caruso. He's got a website that you can look for, and it's called Aramaic NT, AramaicNT.com, and he's got some good stuff up there. I like what he's done. I've never met him, but he's somebody who's kind of in the same area as me. So, in Schrader-Pulser said that this expert in Syriac Aramaic, whom she did not name, but I kind of have a pretty good idea of who it is because of what he is supposed to have said. She quoted him saying that I don't know what I'm talking about, basically to that effect. I don't know what she told him. I would guess that it was not without bias, considering the rather superciliously sharp comments that she made to me in her last e-letter to me, the tone of which was such that I chose not to communicate any further to her. But let's get to the matter at hand. Do I know what I'm talking about with Aramaic or not? The Syriac dialect, which is what pretty much everybody except for Steve Caruso has studied, it didn't exist at the time that the Gospels were written. It only became prominent about 3 or 4 centuries later. So, asking a Syriac Aramaic expert what he thinks of the work of a Galilean Aramaic expert, moi, is rather like asking a Shakespeare scholar to comment on the work of an expert in Beowulf. Now, I'm sure those of you who studied Shakespeare in high school know it's kind of tough to read, but at least you can figure out what it's about. Beowulf, for those of you who haven't studied Old English, Beowulf, even though it's in the same language I'm speaking right now, is pretty much impossible for a modern English speaker to understand unless you look up pretty much every word in a dictionary. Yet it's English. So asking a Syriac expert what he thinks of the work of somebody who knows a dialect 4 centuries earlier than Syriac began to take the place of Galilean Aramaic is like asking a Shakespeare scholar what he thinks of a Beowulf scholar's expertise. So that's the first issue. The second issue I've mentioned before. there is a complete lack of any vowel markings in Galilean Aramaic. Now, Schrader-Pulser suggested on this program that the expert insisted that the vowel markings added to gospel texts centuries later in the Middle Ages would not have confirmed the meanings of the words other than they are, but would confirm the words implicit in the original text without the markings. Now, that strikes me as circular logic, and I disagree. From the point of view of Syriac scholars, the meaning of a given text has always been the same, even before the introduction of vowel markings. The proof of this assertion is that the pointing confirms that it was before the pointing what it was after. That's circular logic. Now, the fact is that if a text originally meant one thing in the first century, long before most of the dogmas of the organized Christian religion were invented, long before the invention of the Trinity, long before the invention of the incarnation of God as God, the second person, as Jesus, etc., then that organized religion, which would innocently have assumed later in Syriac that the pronunciation and meaning of the sacred words must have conformed to the dogmas that they were now promulgating, that these scribes have been taught, had to come directly from God, and the meaning had to be sacrosanct. If privately they thought differently, they wouldn't say a word, because in those days, in the Middle Ages, if they said anything like, well, the Gospel of John originally might have said something else, they would find themselves tied to a stake and being burned to death. Now, there are countless examples of dogma-driven revisions of gospel texts, not only in Aramaic, but also in Greek. And I detail a number of them in the book to give examples. And these dogmatic revisions are what we see with the vowel markings in Syriac Aramaic. In addition, as I mentioned before, the vowel markings freeze the text to one and only one meaning. So no matter whether it is the meaning originally intended or not, that is the only meaning that is accepted. The Gospel of John in Aramaic, as I've said, is much more like poetry than ordinary prose. It is filled with examples where a single word written consonantally has 2, 3, or more correct meanings. And all of these could have been embraced by the original writer. But once you add the vowel markings, you've frozen it to one meaning and one meaning only, and you've turned poetry into prose. You've turned beautiful writing into kind of like newspaper English. Now, Elizabeth Schrader-Pulser's second criticism of me is far more easily answered. She accused me on this program of not bothering to seek peer review of my work. For those of you who don't know the term peer review, that means scholars about to publish a book or an article seek out a number of their colleagues and have them read the text and critique it, tell them if there's any errors, things that they need to fix. Now, she's right. Peer review is extremely important. But her criticism of me was that I have not sought peer review. How she can say this when she doesn't know me, when she hasn't read the book, is beyond my comprehension. If she had read my book, she would have found very quickly in the first volume, I have something like 12, 14 pages of acknowledgments and a lengthy list of scholars who have read all or part of this book and provided me with extremely helpful criticism. Every so often, I add other names to this list, and my gratitude to these peer reviewers is considerable. In fact, just 4 days ago, a respected scholar of the field I know expressed his interest in reading and critiquing the book, but he had to decline with regret, telling me that he just can't commit the time because he's in the final stages of a book of his own that he has to get out. But I have people reading, scholars reading, and I add their names when it applies. I will concede, of course, my gratitude to those who read the whole shebang is great, because it takes a scholar at least weeks to read a book of 6,000 pages. So a number of the scholars that I have in my acknowledgments have read portions of the book that deal with matters upon which they are especially expert. So to be honest about it, like the accusation that I don't know beans about Aramaic, this second one that I don't seek peer review is false. And I would suggest that she who said it withdraw both allegations. On the other hand, any scholars in the field who are sincerely interested in reading and critiquing some or all of this book, let me know. And I'll be happy to send you a copy for electronic form for you to read. Just soon, because the book is in its final edits. The publisher is anxiously waiting for me to get it to them. So, in conclusion, who and what I am is important in no way whatsoever. If I do my job well, then solid facts and careful analyses, 99.9% of which I had to leave out this evening, those solid facts and careful analyses, that's what's important, not the messenger who delivered them, mainly me. I'm not important. What is important is establishing facts as well as I can, backing them up with evidence and using clear, logical analysis to reach a fair conclusion. Sadly, these days, I've seen way too much in the field of Bible studies and of the beginnings of Christianity, of scholars who don't do their work right. I won't mention names, but one scholar, very well-known scholar, in fact, I think he's been on your program, Jacob, who translated a very important Greek text, a very important Latin text into English using Google Translate. That's really pretty impressive work. I couldn't believe what I was reading, because I read Latin, of course, and I was reading the Latin on one side, reading his translation on the other. It was horrible. It was pathetic. I actually wrote to the fellow and pointed out some examples of, without mentioning Google Translate, of course, I mentioned some examples of where I think he might want to put his English translation a little bit better. And he promised me that he would do that. That was about 6 years ago. I'm still waiting. So that's just one example. And there are many others. I have also seen way too much in this field of New Testament studies, the beginning of Christianity, of scholars attacking each other in shockingly nasty ways. Ad hominem attacks on people who too often resort to it because it's easy and tempting, rather than calmly, peacefully discussing the matters themselves with each other. I admit that I'm rather old-fashioned. In an age when major public figures, and you all know who I mean, are lauded for lying and abusing their privileges of office to attack their enemies, I am one of the few left who believe in personal integrity. I also believe that Bible scholars, even more than other disciplines, Bible scholars should strive to live by the precepts that the Bible urges upon us. Love your neighbor as yourself. Be humble. Be patient. Do not bear false witness. And judge not, lest you be judged. When I listened to that program, I felt like I was being judged, and judged falsely. I urge my colleagues not to treat each other in such malicious manner, and to do their work well and be proud of it, but also courteous and respectful of those who disagree. I urge my colleagues to offer constructive, helpful criticism of other people's work without indulging in ad hominem attacks on them as persons. Anyone thinking of issuing such intemperate remarks needs to think very hard beforehand about maintaining their ethical integrity, especially in a world that is going crazy. Thank you.
Did you want to go on to the next page, or is this it?
That's it. That's all I have.
We do have one more super chat. I'll take it before we close.
Sure. Let me find your screen again. I've lost your screen somehow. Go ahead and tell me while I'm trying to find your screen. Here it is. Okay. There we go. Okay. Acts 12. It's Mary Magdalene and John Mark, son of Jesus. Now, I don't know. My time machine is still in the shop, and they haven't fixed it yet. But I do think John Mark is indeed son of Jesus and Mary. John Mark is recorded, especially in Papias and other early texts, as the original author of the Gospel of Mark. And there's quite a lot of evidence that supports that. So yes, I do think that's so, but I can't say anything really for a fact because I wasn't there. I'm an old guy, but I'm not 2,000 years old.
Does the Galilean Aramaic, John, also is it missing John 21?
Oh, wonderful question. This is actually one of the earliest things that I dealt with when I started working with the Gospel of John. The evidence is that there was, as I think I mentioned earlier, a council in Antioch in the year 42, at which Mary Magdalene was first appointed as the apostle to the apostles, where the name Christianum was accepted, not Christianum, but Christianum was accepted for the new movement, and where John the Presbyter was prevailed upon to write an eyewitness account of Jesus's year of ministry, Passover to Passover, 29 to 30, based on mainly on Mary Magdalene's eyewitness memories. That was because Mary Magdalene was about to hit the road. She was to leave the Ephesus area in Anatolia. She spent a few years in Rome, and then she went on to other locations, but that's getting ahead of myself. John spent several months with Mary Magdalene writing down her eyewitness memories. These are the beloved disciples, Mary, the beloved disciple, that comprise the major part of the Gospel of John. And she had John Mark with her in this time, a number of early texts and also images. In a number of the catacombs in Rome, Christian catacombs in Rome, there are images of a woman wearing a tallis, woman wearing priestly garb. There are some scholars, what is her name? Ali Keteush, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Ali Keteush is one who insists that this is the Mother Mary, but by my study, it's Mary Magdalene. She's wearing a tallis, which is priestly garb, normally worn by men only, Jewish men only, the priests of the temple. She's wearing this and holding a baby in her arm, which would have to be most likely John Mark. So, what was the question?
Is John 21 missing from the Galilean
yeah,
Aramaic?
okay.
John?
Thank you. Sorry, I drifted
That's
off into something else. Sorry about that. John, so what convinced the council in Antioch to ask John the Presbyter to write this gospel was the fact that he had earlier, quote, written with Mary an encyclical letter to the 7 congregations in Anatolia, because there was a rumor going on that because Mary and Jesus were now united in the image and likeness of God, that it was immortal. And so this letter was written to reassure people that by no means Mary was mortal. And that letter was separated, was not part of the Gospel of John, which was written later after 42. It was written before 42. And if you read the end of chapter 20 in the Gospel of John, you can see it's a coda. It's a closing. The Gospel of John ends at the end of chapter 20. Chapter 21 then feels like an appendix, and it also has this ending, its coda. What happened, apparently, in this fragments that we have of Papias's book suggest this, is that Papias himself, when he was given the task of arranging all of these fragmentary drafts that John the Presbyter written in Aramaic meant to be the Gospel of John, when he arranged them into a coherent whole, he included the Gospel, John chapter 21 into the text of the Gospel of John. My view, there are other views, of course, but my view is that John 21 existed before the Gospel of John was even conceived of, and that later that Papias inserted it into the Gospel.
So does the manuscript of the Galilean Aramaic, John, is it actually missing John chapter 21 from the manuscript evidence you've seen?
Well, we have nothing early enough to tell us. We only have fragmentary Galilean Aramaic texts from early on, such as the 4th century, the Sinaiticus Rescriptus that I mentioned. They seem to have chapter 21 in place, but that would make sense because Papias was the original person to publish the Gospel of John in the 90s, the last decade of the first century. So we have no reason to expect to see a manuscript of the Gospel of John just 1 through 20. So the answer to that is no. They all seem to have 21 included, but they should because it's after Papias.
Well, thank you for joining me today, James.
Always a pleasure. I really appreciate it, Jacob. And thank you for allowing me to take on this superhuman task of trying to collapse 6,000 pages down to a brief interview program, and also to address the issues that I had with Elizabeth Schrader-Pulser. Thank you very much for both.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.